ॐ तव कथामृतं तप्तजीवनं कविभिरीडितं कल्मषापहं श्रवणमङ्गलं श्रीमदाततं भुवि गृह्णन्ति ये भुरिदा जनाः। In the previous class, we were discussing Sri Ramakrishna in his meeting with the Brahmo devotees. He was talking to a sub-judge and the conversation is going on. Now the topic, though the conversation is going on, the topic has changed. The subject has changed a little bit. And Sri Ramakrishna ended last conversation, if you remember, when we discussed last time. He ended the conversation by saying that as long as you don't have knowledge, as long as you are ignorant of the existence of God, or if you have not experienced Him, he feels as if he is far off. And only when you love Him deeply and you dive deep into your spiritual practices, you don't see Him at a distance. He is no longer, he becomes this. I mean, He resides permanently in your heart and illumines the heart and removes all the darkness of ignorance of the individual. And then He is seen in your own heart. God is in everybody. Whoever seeks Him finds Him. So we have to seek at the right place. We may begin our search, as most religions do, to seek for God outside of ourselves. We pray to God, we pray to a deity whom we imagine to be outside. But at some stage of our life, we have to focus our attention inwards and try to internalize our thoughts. The God whom we worship outside has to be installed in the lotus of the heart within, and he has to be worshipped there. That is why after Durga Puja, after the puja is over, after Visarjan, we pray to the mother and ask her to remain in our heart till we worship her next year, in the following year, externally. So the meaning behind all this external worship is to begin with external worship, but remember that finally the experience of God is to be perceived inside the heart, within ourselves. So whoever finds Him, whoever seeks Him finds Him. So that is what Sri Ramakrishna told the judge. And then judge asks him a question. He says, "But sir, I am a sinner. How can I say that God is within me?" The idea is that he was this Brahmo Samaj. For example, Sri Ramakrishna will point out to that now. Sri Ramakrishna now replies. He says, "You Brahmos always harp on sin." Maybe it's the view of Christianity also, because you remember the Brahmos is a synthetic religion where they took ideas from all religions, a little bit of all religion, without going into the spirit of that religion. They just took the external observances and the external rituals and some of the philosophy of different religions, Hinduism, Christianity, Islam, and other religions, and created a synthetic religion which did not allow their followers to go dive deep into the spirit of the Prophet's teachings, whether it is Christianity, Islam, or Vedanta or Hinduism. So they took the idea of sin, and in the Bible, though we find there's a lot of mention of the jiva or the human being being a sinner, and that God has to come and save us from our sins. So he says, maybe somebody gave me a book, the Bible, Sri Ramakrishna is telling the sub-judge now. I asked someone to read me a little. It was all about only one thing, sin and sin. Maybe the portion of the Bible which was read out to Sri Ramakrishna contained these teachings. Maybe from some other portion of the Bible, not exactly what Jesus said. But then he says, I have chanted his name, but Sri Ramakrishna says, for me, I believe that I have chanted his name, Ishvara, Rama, or Hari. How can I be a sinner? There is God within me. So how can I be a sinner? You must have such faith. You must have faith in the power of God's name. Then the sub-judge asks another question. Sir, how do you have such faith? It's all right when you said that once I have chanted the name of Hari or Rama or my Ishta, how can sin reside within me? I mean, I have been purified of all the sins. That faith, if it comes, faith is everything, as we discussed a few classes ago, where a Holy Mother also says, Holy Mother Sharda Devi says, if you have faith, you have everything. So now the question asked by these Brahmo devotees, if we have that faith, that I have changed, burning faith, that I have chanted the name of my Ishta, my Lord, and the chanting of that name or remembering him, his name is powerful enough to remove the effects of all my sins. Of course, my sins will not be undone. They have been done in the past. I mean, the wrong things which I have done. But then how do I negate the effect? So Sri Ramakrishna is answering now. The simplest way is to love him. One of your Brahmo song says, I mean, he's quoting another good Brahmo song. Brahmas, of course, had taken good ideas from different religions. So there were some very good, beautiful songs as well. So one of the songs Sri Ramakrishna is quoting here, perhaps he's not singing, but he's quoting that song, the meaning of the song, that Lord, can one ever know you without loving you? By only performing worship and sacrifice. I mean, the Brahmos were very less ritualistic, though they had their own rituals, they had their own prayers, but it was basically a religion based on prayer and congregational worship, not the ritualistic worship. It was there, but it was minimum. So that's why one of the songs, one of the Brahmo devotees perhaps would have composed this song, that unless we love God and not just be happy with worship and sacrifice to him, how can we ever know him? We can't know you unless we love you. We can't know a person unless we love that person and know and try to be close with him. And that love will make us know everything about that person. But from a distance, you know that person only partly. So that is the idea. So then Sri Ramakrishna says something very significant. He says, pray and cry. Weep out loud to him in solitude, that you may gain such attraction from him, for such an attraction for him, such love for him. Now that love which will give you that faith, the question asked here is, how can I get that faith which will remove all my sins? Then Sri Ramakrishna says, love him. Then he says, how can I have that faith, or how can I love him? Then he says, weep out loud to him, because we weep for so many things. Sri Ramakrishna is pointing out that now people shed pictures full of tears when their wives are ill, or they lose money, or for a job. Who weeps for God? Just tell me, I would like to know. Now Sri Ramakrishna is saying, we weep for so many things of this world, and crying is very natural. We may not physically weep, but internally we feel sorrowful. We weep for many things. We are depressed for not having attained so many things or got so many things in the world. So he says, why don't you do it for God? How many of you can really weep because you're not seen God, you're not experienced God, you don't love him as you love things of the world? How many people can do it? If you can love God as you love things of the world, then just as you can acquire the things of the world by loving those things. Most of us, when we very, very sincerely want certain things, we try so hard, we work so hard, we even cry for it. and somehow we get it. In the things of the world, I mean. So he says, in a similar way, if you just direct that those tears, that weeping and that yearning. By weeping, that doesn't mean just crying. When Sri Ramakrishna says weeping for God means trying to develop a yearning to get him. That yearning is known as weeping. When a person yearns sincerely, he may or may not cry. Tears may not come physically, I mean, in the eyes, but he really yearns to attain that or to get that object for which he or she is weeping. But then if that object is God, or if you are weeping for God, then there is no reason why God should not be experienced by any person, whoever has yearned for him. That's the idea. So he says, if you can love him by weeping for him, by crying for him, by praying for him sincerely, by yearning for him, if you have that kind of sincere desire to attain God or to yearn for God, if you yearn for God the same way you yearn for things of the world, then he says you can surely see him, or you can have that faith that he can remove all your sins, that you, no matter how many sins you might have committed in the past, they will all be washed out, burnt out by the love of God which you have in your heart. So the very purpose of our sadhana, any sadhana, prayer, karma yoga, jnana yoga, or raj yoga, or bhakti yoga, through our prayers, through our meditation, through the repetition of the holy name, japa and all, we aim at not only getting the love of God and but also trying to develop more and more faith. As we go on doing sadhana, you'll see this faith increases. As the faith increases, the love for God increases. And as the love for God increases, Sri Ramakrishna says, the effects of your past karma are slowly washed off, and then you become holier and holier. You become more and more spiritual as you go towards the higher levels of existence. So now, Trailokya, who was sitting there all the while, the conversation is between the judge and the sub-judge, whose name is not mentioned. Perhaps M did not know his name, or perhaps did not want to disclose. So in any case, that sub-judge was asking all these questions till now. Trailokya interferes and tries to tell Sri Ramakrishna that he is a very busy man. That's why perhaps he can't pray, he can't do meditation, he can't do japa. So he says, sir, he has no time. He has to work for the British. I mean, in those days, those who got some kind of employment with the British were normally had to work very hard, because that's the discipline which they enforced on the people who sought. Of course, their salary was good, everything was good. The British paid them handsomely. But then the work they had to do was equally hard and difficult. They had very little time. They were great taskmasters. That's why they ruled India. So the British, so jokingly, Trailokya is saying, had he been employed by some Indian firm, then the work would not have been so much. But since he says he has no time, he has to work for the British. So Sri Ramakrishna then turns to the sub-judge. He accepts the fact that the sub-judge doesn't have time, because he is to work day and night. And though he has a desire to love God, desire to pray for God, desire to do meditation, his job or his profession doesn't allow him, especially if he is a judge. He has to attend the court and give all sorts of decisions, work very hard. So he says, well, since he is a judge, Thakur is now using legal language to explain to him. He says, well, give God the power of attorney. That's what Girish Chandra Ghosh did. So Girish was asked by Thakur to perform some simple devotional practices, repeat the name of the Lord. Girish said, I don't have time. I can't promise you that I'm such a busy. He was a playwright. He could write 4 or 5 dramas at a time, and then he had to organize the theater. So he was a very busy person. And he knew, and because of his bad habits also, he often used to be drunk, because of he was used to get very tired after his strenuous. Sometimes he used to act in his own dramas. So acting, writing, he was a playwright, he used to write his own dramas, uh, enact them, direct his dramas, and sometimes, most of the times, he used to act in his own dramas. So he was a very busy person, and the tension was so much that rest of the time he used to spend in either drinking or in bad company. So Girish Ghosh knew that if I promise something to Sri Ramakrishna, at least he was honest that I can't promise anything. Yeah, I can't even assure you that I can do my japa regularly, take the name of the Lord. Then Sri Ramakrishna says, can you at least remember God once, maybe just before you go to sleep? But even that was not possible for Girish. He thought, perhaps sometimes if I'm in a drunk state, I do not know what state I am, and I might simply go to sleep. So I should not be dishonest. I should not deceive my guru. So he says, no, I can't promise you that I will remember him at least once in a day and then go to sleep. Then Sri Ramakrishna said, in that case, there is the last option which I can give you. You please give me the power of attorney. That is, power of attorney is what the sub-judge would have immediately understood. That if somebody is unable to represent his case or do any take any legal action, he gives the power of attorney to somebody else on his behalf, and that document is enough for the other person to fight the case or to do everything on his behalf, on the person who gives the power of attorney. So Girish Chandra Ghosh was apparently very happy that Sri Ramakrishna has taken the entire responsibility of his sadhana and he doesn't have to do anything. He thought it was a very easy thing, but later on he realized that it was not as easy to give the power of attorney, because if you do that, then you don't have your will. The moment you try to enforce your will or try to do something, the person who has been given the power of attorney says, you have given the power of attorney, now let me do as I know let me do what I think is the best. You can't do anything now. You give me the power of attorney and then you keep interfering. That is not possible. So Girish found that it was so difficult to live after that because he could not do anything of his own will. Whatever Sri Ramakrishna decided, he had to do. So giving of power of attorney, though apparently it's a very simple technique, but it is a spirit of Sharanagati. In the Vedanta, we call it a spirit of Sharanagati. Sharanagati means I surrender everything to Lord. I don't exercise my own will. And as a result of which, the Lord has promised in the Gita, he says, Sarva dharman parityajya mamekam sharanam vraja aham tvam sarva papebhyo moksha ishyami mashuchaha. In the last chapter, Sri Krishna is also promising Arjuna that you have heard everything, but still if you are confused, sarva dharman, I mean all the actions, parityajya mamekam sharanam vraja, you surrender to me and surrender all your actions to me. Don't do anything by your own will or through your own ego. If you give up your ego and just do at my bidding, whatever I say, then sarva dharman parityajya mamekam, to me alone you surrender. Sharanam vraja, that sharanagati or the power of attorney, if you give it to me, aham tvam, aham means I, the Sri Krishna is telling, I shall save you. Aham tvam sarva papebhyo moksha ishyami. I'll save you from all sins, whatever sins you might have committed in this life or in the previous lives. I will protect you and I will save you from the bad effects of that. So that Sharanagati is the last word in spirituality. Now, but for people who have no other option, perhaps this may be the only way, and that is how Girish Ghosh told Sri Ramakrishna that, you see, I am incapable of doing anything. So you just I surrender everything to you and you do everything on my behalf. I am giving. So Sri Ramakrishna took the power of attorney and then did what needed to be done. And then you see the result, how Girish Ghosh gets transformed into a saint, A sinner becomes a saint. So also to the sub-judge, when Trailokya says he is working for the British, he doesn't get any time. Then he says, why don't you give the power of attorney to God? Since you can't do anything, then the only option left now for you is to give the power of attorney. If you give the burden to a good person, provided you have faith in him, power of attorney is normally given to a person on whom you have faith. You don't just give power of attorney to somebody who is likely to cheat you. So he says, if you believe in the power of God and the goodness of God, of the Lord, then why don't you, can he ever do you any wrong? So if you give your burden to him, you don't have to worry, because he will never do any wrong. He will guide you along the proper path. Give him your entire burden with a sincere heart, and then be at peace. Do only the work he assigns to you. I mean, take everything as God's supreme will. Whatever comes to you unasked for, you accept it, whether good or bad. If suffering comes, you accept it, surrender to him, and then just bear with whatever God has meted out to you. And if joy comes, you accept it without any interference of your ego in any way. You have to, but it is a very, very difficult path. It's very easy to say that I surrender everything to God. Then Sri Ramakrishna gives another example of a kitten. He in fact gives two examples, one of a young one of a monkey holding on to the mother, and the other one is the kitten who depends on the cat, the mother of the kitten. He says a kitten doesn't have a calculating mind like the monkey. It just cries mew mew. If its mother puts it in the kitchen, it will lie there. The mother sometimes feels that the the kitten has to be protected from the cold. So it will put that kitten near the fireplace. So the mother cat knows what is good for the kitten. So the kitten does just obeys. It just sits quietly and waits for the mother to come and take it to some other place. Whenever the kitten feels that now the kitten has got enough warmth, now it is time for food, so it may take that kitten and take that kitten to some other place. It only mews for its mother. Whenever it wants something, it just mews. And when the mother puts it on a bed, it is the same. It repeats mew mew. So wherever it goes, the only thing it needs to do is cry or pray to the mother. And the mother knows where exactly the child should be, what is good for him, where the kitten should be. So it doesn't have to worry. Whereas Sri Ramakrishna used to say, if a monkey, the young one of a monkey has to hold on to its mother. So the moment it lets go its grip, it will fall down. So there's a big risk. Whereas the kitten holds the cat holds the kitten by its neck very firmly and doesn't allow it to fall, and takes care of the kitten throughout its growth. I mean, till it grows and becomes a cat. Now, then Sri Ramakrishna says, the sub-judge says, after Sri Ramakrishna says, you just give the power of attorney. Then he says, then the second question which the sub-judge asks is that we are householders. How long do we have to attend to worldly duties? I mean, he is convinced by Sri Ramakrishna's saying that just before this, Sri Ramakrishna had mentioned that why don't you pray to God like you pray for your worldly things. So now these worldly duties and the worldly objects with which one has to be engaged throughout the day, he says we are householders. How long do we have to attend to our worldly duties? So the question is, how can I free myself so that I get more time for spiritual practices? My worldly duties are there. And how do I decide when it is time, at what age I should just give up these worldly duties and focus on crying for God or worshipping God or praying for God, taking his name and all those things. Right now I don't have, but then there should be a limit. Or should I go on doing these worldly duties till I drop down dead? Now that is the question he is asking, because he is worried, because perhaps he is a very senior judge, he is a sub-judge, so naturally he is a senior person. and he perhaps feels that a lot of time has been lost in this life. Now, when will I start my spiritual practices? Whatever Sri Ramakrishna is saying is correct. But at the same time, he wants to know that I can't give up my job right now. I am already a subject. So, when should I stop doing my worldly duties? Then Sri Ramakrishna gives a very nice answer. He knows it is very difficult for a person who has taken up the responsibility of his family, of several other people who depend on him for survival. So once you have entered the world, then it is not good for you to give up those duties. If you are not engaged in the world, if you are free, as Holy Mother said, there are some people, especially the young, the young women who unfortunately became child widows. In those days, it was there was some movement started by the intellectuals of Calcutta to remarry those widows, or maybe do something and not leave them to their fate, because a lot of young girls became widows when they were young. So there was this widow remarriage act and all those things, discussions were going on. So some of the educated people brought their daughters who were widows, I mean, who had become widows at a very young age. And naturally, according to the tradition or according to the widow, that girl's wish, the girl did not want to marry. So her mother, the girl's mother, came to Holy Mother, Sharda Devi, and said, we are telling her to marry again, or maybe to marry, but she's reluctant. She doesn't want to marry. She wants to be free. Then Holy Mother says something very significant. If somebody doesn't want to marry or doesn't wants to be free, why do you force? Let her decide what she wants to do. If she doesn't want to get entangled in the world, she's half free. She can live her life as she wants. So here Sri Ramakrishna is saying that for those people it is okay. But for you who have, for some reason or the other, been entangled in this world, then you have to fulfill your duties. You can't just say, I want to get rid of my worldly duties. Having entered the world, you should have been cautious before. So he says, of course, you have your duties to bring up your children, to provide for your wife, and to save money for her when you are no more. If you don't do this, then you are a heartless fellow. So being a human being, and after marrying, after having children, and after having a wife and a family, if you don't make provisions for their security, then you are a heartless fellow. So Sri Ramakrishna is discouraging. But he says Shukadeva and other sages had compassion. A person who had no compassion is not a human being. Of course, Shukadeva was not married. So he says, whether you are a householder or whether you choose to remain free like Shukadeva, there should be compassion in you. That is more important. If you have compassion, then you have first have compassion for your family members, then you have compassion for the entire world. And of course, without that compassion, you can't be even called a human being, leave alone a spiritual being. So he says it's not possible if you don't do this. Then he says, the sub-judge asks, now his question is that my children will someday grow up. So how long should I look after my children? So sub-judge asks another practical question to Thakur. How long must one look after one's children? Now Sri Ramakrishna, you see, gives a very practical answer. He is telling in a very jocular way, in a very humorous way. He says, oh, why? Till they reach adulthood. Till they reach adulthood, you look after them. You just don't go on pampering them till they grow up, until they have their children, and then you bother about the grandchildren. So then there is no end to it. Till the children grow up to adulthood and they are able to live an independent life, there your duties end. After that, you don't have any duty. So he says, till they reach adulthood. When a bird grows up, he is giving an example from the animal kingdom, from the bird kingdom, that even birds don't pamper their children after a certain time. They have nothing to do once the bird grows. So we have to learn these lessons from the bird. Even as a householder, he says, your duty ends when you make them into adults, and once they become adults, you are free. Now you should be focusing on your own spiritual development instead of uh, uh, spending more time. So Sri Ramakrishna very carefully says, very nicely is pointing out, when a bird grows up and can look after itself, its mother forces it out of the nest with its beak. In fact, even if the bird which has grown up and which can live live by itself, if the bird refuses to leave the nest, it simply uses the beak and pushes it out of the nest and says, "Now you go, now you fly. I have uh, educated you, I have trained you, I have fed you, I have done whatever I can. That was my duty. But after that, once you can live for yourself, once you can stand on your own legs, then you don't need my support. So then there should not be any further duty for that person." So he says she doesn't let it near. I mean, she sees that the bird doesn't return back to the nest. So Sri Ramakrishna is giving a hint that since you are in the world and you believe and you have created a responsibility for yourself, your responsibility ends when your child grows up, you have educated him, and after that, you lead a stage of life which in the Hindu tradition is known as Vanaprastha. So Vanaprastha was created exactly for that. The very system, social system of Vanaprastha after Brahmacharya and Grihastha there was a stage of life where the parents were supposed to prepare themselves from gradual withdrawal from the world. And that gradual withdrawal, because as Jesus said, you cannot have both God and mammon at the same time. If you have the world, then you cannot have God. You can't have both. You can't be looking outward and inward at the same time. At some stage, though not immediately, very gradually, the focus of our mind has to be withdrawn, as we discussed yesterday, from the external to the internal. And the right time for a householder, according to Sri Ramakrishna, he is telling the judge, because that was his question, because I have my children, so when does my responsibility end? So Sri Ramakrishna says, when they grow up, when they are able to fend for themselves, when they are able to stand on their own legs, your duty ends. Then it's time for you to focus inwards and not be unnecessarily attached and bothered about their children and then their welfare and all those things, because they are capable of looking after themselves. Just as the mother bird doesn't bother, because it knows I've trained the children or trained the younger one, and it has grown enough. It can search for its own food, it can do everything, it can maintain a family now. So the younger bird doesn't need my help. So that if even birds do that, Sri Ramakrishna is pointing out in a very jolly way, in a very joking way, is telling him, even the birds with their beak, they don't let they just force the younger one out of it. Not younger one, it has grown now, the bird out of it, and ask the bird to fly and make its own live on its own. So everybody laughs. So then he asks, this is about the children. Now the next question is, what about the wife? The children, of course, they will look after themselves, their own. Then Sri Ramakrishna even answers this. What is one's duty towards one's own wife? Because I can't just drive her out like I drive out the children. That's natural, because children can, but the wife has to be dependent on me. That's the question. So during your lifetime, now you see Sri Ramakrishna gives a very practical answer. During your lifetime, you must instruct her in religion and must provide for her. Provided, of course, in those days, the women were most of the time they were housewives. They were not earning members of the family. Now, of course, the things have changed. The women are earning themselves. So perhaps it may not be equally valid now, but the idea was that the breadwinner of the family was only one. The wife was supposed to concentrate and focus on bringing up the children, training them, and doing all the, it was a full-time job, and she had to do it nicely. That was part of the parenting which our ancient society did. Not that the women were not earning money. Of course, they were doing a great job by saving the money, by doing everything as the husband was busy earning the money. So that was the system in India. And Sri Ramakrishna says, as long as she is alive, because you have to be responsible, having married her. Even Sri Ramakrishna, if you see, he led the ideal householder's life as well. When he was about to take Mahasamadhi, mother was very, compared to his age, she was very young, and he knew that she has to live for a very long time. Say 34 years she lived after Sri Ramakrishna passed away. But you see how his practical wisdom worked. Though he was in a totally different plane, always living in Samadhi and talking of God, he asked her, how many rotis do you take? How much food you require? So he calculated in his own simple way. And he said, I will ensure that you will get enough money after I go away to sustain yourself. And the amount of money, 7 rupees, I think, was the salary, which he hardly ever used his money. So he saved all that money and for Sri Ma Sharda Devi, and said that he made sure that she was taken, that 7 rupees per month would be enough for her, that pension was enough for her to make a decent, simple living. And unfortunately, even that pension was stopped because some of the jealous relatives of Sri Ramakrishna felt after his passing away that she perhaps doesn't need it. So they went and told the Dakshineshwar temple administration that she has enough devotees and people to look after her, so you don't have to give what is due to her. She doesn't need it. And that 7 rupees, unfortunately, was stopped. It was such, but mother never asked for that money. Somehow she managed with whatever hard work and without, if you see that phase of her life, because Sri Ramakrishna had told him, don't depend on anybody, don't ask for anybody for financial or any other help. After I pass away, you go to Kamarpukur and whatever little land we have, try to cultivate and grow something and eat, but don't stretch your hands in front of anybody. So even when those 7 rupees were denied to her, which were rightfully hers, Sri Ramakrishna had arranged for that. And in spite of that, she never asked anybody, or she led a very frugal life, full of hardship. Sometimes she did not have salt to cook, and she had to be just content with whatever little rice they got from the land they had in Kamarpukur. And it was Holy Mother's own mother who came from Jairambati and saw that she did not have proper clothes to wear or food to eat. She interfered and said, you come to Jairambati, how will you struggle like this? Seeing the poverty. But still, she did not ask. So, but Sri Ramakrishna's greatness was that he saw to it that she would get her monthly allowance of 7 rupees, which he used to get as a priest of the Dakshineshwar temple, which he never used. So he saw to it, he ensured that his wife Sri Ma Sharda Devi would be looked after. At least financially, she doesn't have to struggle for a few years. But unfortunately, that money was stopped. So Sri Ramakrishna says, during your lifetime, you must instruct. He says, the sub-judge is asking, what is one's duty towards one's wife? Because the children have to be educated, I got it. So how long should I be engaged in my duties towards my wife? So he says, as long as you are alive, you must, during your lifetime, you must instruct her in religion and must provide for her, both. It is not enough, because after your death, suppose she continues to live, she has to have some spiritual background. So it is a householder's duty to not only provide the material support for her existence after his death, but also provide her with spiritual sustenance. And that is what Sri Ramakrishna did. If you see the initial training he gave all sorts of training to Ma Sharda Devi. When she came from a village to join her husband at Dakshineshwar, he taught her everything, how to save water, how to save the oil in the lamp, everything which how to live a frugal life, a simple life, and yet he taught all the intricacies of spiritual sadhana and all those things. So spiritual training was the main training which he gave her, plus at the same time he did not neglect the other part, other training which will enable Sri Ma Sharda Devi to lead a smooth life even after his passing away. So he says, during your lifetime you must instruct her in religion, whatever little you know, and must provide for her. If she is chaste, you must make plans for her care when you are gone. Because for a wife who survives the husband, she doesn't, of course, would not like to depend on anybody else. So you have to make provisions and see. That's what Sri Ramakrishna did. He tried to ensure that she will be taken care of after his passing away, which was nearly 34 years. So that is what Sri Ramakrishna is telling the subject. So at least you must earn and save enough so that your wife doesn't have to suffer in case you die earlier than her. However, when a person is overwhelmed, now he says, but there are exceptions to these rules. This is what a normal householder should do. But there are some instances where there may be exceptions. And those exceptions we can see in the life of Swami Vivekananda also. However, when a person is overwhelmed with spiritual knowledge, he is left with no duties to perform. There are a few, like Sri Ramakrishna himself, when he was asked by his elder brother and the mother and everybody to go to Calcutta and earn a living, he said, I'm not going to earn. He was overwhelmed with the love of God. And he believed that if I surrender fully and focus fully on God, then God will take care of all my needs. And you find yoga kshemam vaham miham. Sri Krishna also says, if somebody surrenders to me fully, I take care of his yoga and kshema. Yoga means to acquire what one doesn't have. Kshema means to preserve what he already has. So that is how most of the saints' lives, if you see, they were taken care of in mysterious ways by the graceful intervention of the Ishta whom they were worshipping. None of them suffered. In fact, Swami Brahmananda once tells his disciple, somebody who was a worldly, a householder disciple of Swami Brahmananda, he said, don't worry, I can promise you that there will be no harm if you hold on to God and if you pray properly. And even Swami Trigunatitanji once told his disciples in America, when many of them were doubting whether one can lead a full-time spiritual life, giving up all because most of them were not well-to-do. So some of them had worries whether they will. So Trigunatitanji had so much faith in Thakur and Ma and others, the divine. So he said, if you totally depend on the divine, and he says, I have not seen a single case in my life where a genuine devotee has suffered the want of the basic necessities of life. The basic necessities of life have never been denied to anybody who is sincerely strived to realize God and who has surrendered to God. So Trigunatitananji, in one of his letters, he writes to one of his disciples, see, if you have faith, don't worry, I have not come here to misguide you. If you have faith and if you really surrender to God, then it is God's responsibility and he will take care of everything. So he says, however, when a person is overwhelmed with spiritual knowledge, he is left with no duties to perform, as Sri Ramakrishna did. At Swamiji himself had some duties. There was a case going on, his father died, and everybody felt that he should not renounce the world and leave his parents, his mother, his brothers, sisters. They were suffering from economic problems as well, apart from being apart from the risk of being driven out from their house. There was a legal case. Of course, Swamiji fought the case, won the case, and saw to it that they were not deprived of their own ancestral house. And somehow Sri Ramakrishna then promised. He prayed to mother, but he could not ask. But Sri Ramakrishna promised that your parents, your mother and your family will not suffer for want of the basic needs of life. When that assurance was given by Thakur, then Swamiji had the heart to, because he knew that there was a wonderful spiritual mission which had to be undertaken, and Sri Ramakrishna wanted him to do that. So in that case, of course, the question of responsibility does not arise. So he says, God, however, when a person is overwhelmed with spiritual knowledge, he is left with no duties to perform. How is that? God takes charge when you are no longer able to do so. If you are really focusing your attention on God, then He does what you were supposed to do. He says, when a zamindar dies, Sri Ramakrishna gives some beautiful examples. When a zamindar dies, leaving behind a minor son, a guardian takes the entire responsibility for the boy. It is a matter of law. During the British government, that was a law that the guardian has to take care, and it was a kind of obligation, a legal obligation. So the sub judge knew that, and then he says, "It's some." You see, Sri Ramakrishna is telling the lawyer in his own language. He says, "Don't you give that order? If somebody dies, the zamindar, a rich person dies, and he leaves behind money, then if they have a minor son, perhaps he does not inherit it because he is not able to take care of all the wealth and the property and all. So there is a guardian is appointed who does everything on his behalf till he grows and he is able to sustain himself." So he says, it's a matter of law. You know that quite well. The sub judge says, yes, sir. Then Vijay Krishna Goswami, who was sitting along with Trailokanath and others, they were listening to this conversation. And he exclaims, because he was a though he was a household, he was a great devotee as well. And he believed in the path of devotion and the path of self-surrender. So he says, what a beautiful statement. God himself takes the burden of one who meditates on him. So he is tremendously impressed by this uh, conviction of Sri Ramakrishna that God, just as the judge decides that the entire responsibility of the minor son whose zamindar father has died will devolve upon the guardian who is appointed for that purpose. Similarly, God arranges everything for a person. His minor needs, his basic needs, he fulfills. Uh, his minor need because his devotee has surrendered to him. So with a fixed mind who is mad with ecstatic love for God, for him, God takes care of his responsibility. So Vijay Krishna Goswami is very much impressed and says, what a wonderful idea I heard today. Though it was there in the scriptures, it is there, that promise is made in the Bhagavad Gita, it is made in the Bible. Jesus also says, man does not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes out of the Lord's mouth. Means it's the Lord's will which will make a man survive in this world, not just by bread, just by earning his bread. So somehow God will see to it that his needs are fulfilled. So that is the refrain of all the religious leaders of the world. All the religious traditions and people who believe in a personal God believe firmly with conviction and with faith that those who really yearn for God and sacrifice their everything for God and surrender fully to Him, not partially, fully to Him, then God takes care of his needs. So that is a universal phenomena which has been seen in countless saints and sages and incarnations who have come on this earth. So Sri Ramakrishna says, a minor at once gets a guardian. Vijay Krishna Goswami is saying, oh, when will such a state of mind come? So Vijay Krishna Goswami is now highly inspired by this thought, that when will that state come to me, that I can just relax as a minor son. The minor son doesn't have to worry because it knows law will see to it that some guardian will take care of him. So can I be dependent on God like that? Can I spend my whole life in total self-surrender to Him so that He takes care of my needs? He says, whoever experiences such a state, but it is very, very rare. This Sri Ramakrishna and also Trailokya and this Vijay Krishna Goswami know that these cases you don't see very often, because you don't get that kind of self-surrender, that kind of faith, that kind of conviction in the power of God or the capacity of God to help you and surrender everything to Him without. So somehow or the other we feel like helping ourselves. So Sri Ramakrishna used to make fun, and he says there are some people who pray to different gods, and when the wind is blowing, they just, they try to first save. Then when they find that they are not possible to save their house, then they cry to one god, and then when they see the prayer is not being answered, they call another god. In Hinduism, we have so many gods. So then when he sees the other god is not coming, he will pray to some other god. And then finally, when he realizes, because that is not the kind of devotion one is expected to have. If one has one pointed devotion in the Ishta and believe in the redeeming power of that Ishta or that personal God whom he worships, and loves him and reposes his entire faith in him, then God comes to your help. So that precondition is there. It's not enough if we just verbally say, I surrender everything to God. So that's why he says, such a person is very lucky, because it is very rare to have that kind of self-surrender or that kind of attitude. Then Trailokya is asking now, Sri Ramakrishna, uh, Sir, is it possible to gain true knowledge of God while living in the world? Can one really attain God? Now that is his idea. He says, till now the Brahmos and all those people, they were just talking of God, that religion is good, one should follow this, one should belong to a particular religion. But very few people are really serious about experiencing God. So he says, can one get true knowledge of God while living in this world, while living in a family? Can one really attain God? Then Sri Ramakrishna laughingly in a very joking way says, why not? You are already completely absorbed in Him. All laugh. You are already living in the world and you have given your mind to Him. Why shouldn't it be possible to realize God in the household? Certainly it is. I mean, just to console Vijay Krishna Goswami or Trailokya, because Trailokya was a really a capable and a devoted soul. So Thakur was very keen that he doesn't get further entangled in the world. Though he had a family and everything, he knew that he can become a great devotee of God. That's why just to inspire him, he says, why not? You are still absorbed in Him, you are singing His songs. That's what he used to do for a living. He used to sing in the court of the king who employed him, and also come and sing here in front of Sri Ramakrishna, also sing in Brahmo gatherings. So Swami Thakur used to love him, and he said that you direct your singing, your whole profession you can direct towards God. Sing for Him, and then your profession itself will take you to. So living in the world and having a profession where you can sing for money, now he is singing because that is why he is employed. The kings used to employ the singers. But don't take it as a job. If you do that job as a worship of your Ishta or God, then staying in the world you can attain Him. That's the consolation he is giving him. So then he says, afterwards there is one more question, we'll do that, and afterwards we will have some question answers. Now, signs of a householder Gyani, signs of God realization, and to be free in this very life. This is the new topic, that how to attain Jivan Mukta. Now Trailokyanath and Vijay Krishna Goswami have asked many questions. The sub-judge has asked many questions and Thakur has answered them to their satisfaction. They are very happy that some of their basic doubts have been removed. They've got the confidence that a person living in the household also can attain love for God and experience Him. So Trailokya is asking now another question. How do we know? What are the signs of a householder having attained knowledge of God? Suppose a householder has a knowledge of God. As you say, if it is possible, is asking Sri Ramakrishna, how do we know which householder? Because all are living in the household. So if by living in the household you can have knowledge of God simultaneously, then how do I recognize that householder, that person? Sri Ramakrishna now gives a standard test or a standard proof that a person has realized God. Now this is very tough, because the conditions which Sri Ramakrishna is giving here it is very, very difficult to see these conditions in ordinary householders. So he says, or even ordinary human beings. So Sri Ramakrishna says, tears flow from his eyes and hair on his body stands on end at the name of God. No sooner does he hear the sweet name of God, then the hair on his body stands on end and a stream of tears flow from his eyes. So this is one of the signs, which is a result of intense love and devotion for God. So Trailokya and others definitely have understood by now that it is not very easy, because these signs are not easy to get for ordinary human beings. We don't get ecstatic when we hear the name of our Lord. We don't love him enough that the mere mention of the Lord's name or hearing his song, we go into ecstasy. The hair on our body stands on its end. That is the sign of ecstasy, the physical sign. So very often M used to observe and record that whenever Sri Ramakrishna heard these devotional songs and dive deep into the meaning of those songs, not just the music and the rhythm, when he dived deep into the inner meaning of those songs, he got overwhelmed, and those signs like the hair standing on the end were naturally seen by everybody. It was a daily scene which they saw. So Sri Ramakrishna is telling Trailokya that you are a very good singer, but the day tears flow from your eyes when you are singing these songs. Tears means not artificial tears, the real tears of joy of having the vision or missing the Lord or loving him. If that kind of devotion comes, then he says, no sooner, that means that you have got some knowledge of God, if these signs are seen. What are the other signs? But he says these things are not very common, because the reason is, he says, as long as there is attachment to worldly things, as long as there is attraction for lust and greed, body consciousness doesn't leave you. The fewer the attachments, the nearer you are to the knowledge of the self. Near you are to the knowledge of self means Atma Jnana. Because as I said, the further we go away from these koshas, we can't get rid of these koshas. These will remain. Annamaya kosha, Pranamaya kosha, the Manomaya kosha, Vijnanamaya kosha. But he says, the fewer the attachments, the fewer we are concerned with the gross things of the world, the more time we spend on the higher things of the world, higher things of our spiritual personality, then he says the body consciousness to some extent becomes less and less. So Sri Ramakrishna is showing the pathway that don't expect that ecstatic love of God to come to you so easily. If you really want to realize God by living in this world, by living in the family life, then these things you have to practice. You have to somehow give up your attraction for lust and greed. Kamini Kanchan, as used to say. One attains the knowledge of Atman when the body consciousness becomes less. One attains the knowledge of Atman when attachment to the world has completely disappeared. Now full knowledge will come. There will be partial knowledge before one attains to this. One loses his body consciousness fully, that is in Samadhi. Then one begins to feel that the soul is one and the body is another. Now this is a very wonderful example Sri Ramakrishna is giving to show how can a soul feel its distinctness from the body. Body and soul are right now intermixed with each other. When we say I, the idea of the soul is there, but the idea of the body also comes immediately, as if they are connected. So Sri Ramakrishna gives a wonderful example from our day-to-day life, and he says, Sri Ramakrishna gives a wonderful example from our day-to-day life, and he says, just like the coconut, he's giving a wonderful example here. He says, it is difficult to separate the kernel of a coconut from its shell with a knife until the water in it is dried up. A raw coconut, if you take, and if you try to remove the kernel which is there inside, the hard cover is there, inside the hard shell is there. Inside the hard shell, the kernel sticks to the shell. And with the knife, you have to scrape it and remove it. You can't separate the kernel so easily. So Sri Ramakrishna gives a beautiful example. It is difficult to separate the kernel of a coconut from its shell with a knife until the water in it has dried up. Till the kernel, the water in the kernel, which is moist and it sticks to the shell of the coconut, the inside of the shell of the coconut, the whole nut. As long as the water is there, till it does not dry, it gets stuck and it is difficult to separate the two. But he says, but when the water is dried up, that's why they allow the coconut to dry. And when the coconut dries, they just break it so that the shell and the kernel, they are different. That's how they extract oil from the kernel. The kernel comes out as a separate piece. So Sri Ramakrishna says, when the water has dried up, you have to just strike and shake it and the kernel becomes detached. This is called a dry coconut. The signs of God realizations are that a man becomes like a dry coconut. He is rid of identification with the body. His kosha, just like the kernel gets separated from the sukshma sharira, is able to detach from the sthula sharira, the annamaya kosha, the gross body, or the soul which is the kernel, is able to give up his attachment to all the koshas, all the 5 koshas. So progressively, this drying process, Sri Ramakrishna is saying, just as a coconut dries progressively and the kernel becomes another piece, and the shell of the coconut gets separated from it. The signs of God realization are that a man becomes like a dry coconut. He is rid of identification with the body. Pleasure and pain of the body are no longer his concern. He will feel it. Just as the kernel inside is attached, it has a connection with the shell. It's not that they have separated, but they are loose and they are having some gap in between. So he says he does not seek the comforts of the body. He roams about as one liberated in his very life. So in this very life, they are like Jivan Muktas. Their shell has separated from the kernel. So the core, the spirit, watches the Purusha, which is beyond the 5 koshas or the 5 shariras, which are responsible for bondage. Those are broken, and when that is broken, when that is disconnected, and how does it get disconnected? By draining the water, or maybe when the water dries. That's why he says they roam about as people who are liberated in life. So he says, then he ends. There are other examples which he is giving, which we'll discuss in the next class. He says, Kali's devotees are free in this very life. They are full of unending joy because they have touched Kali, they have touched God, which is the kernel, and the kernel has dried up, and that drying has resulted through renunciation. It has dried up and the shell has been separated, and they are full of joy because they are no longer attached. It is not difficult to remove the kernel from the shell. That is, when you see tears begin to flow and the hair on the body stand on end at the very name of God, know that the attachment to lust and greed has disappeared and that one has realized God. If a matchstick is dry, strike it just once and it will light. But if it is wet, if the matchstick is wet, you may strike it 50 times, but it won't ignite. You have just wasted the wooden sticks. If your mind is immersed in the liquid of the worldly pleasures, it is wet with lust and greed. So the water represents the attachment we have with this world. So lust and greed and all those things, they make us attached to the shell, attached to the worldly things, and the shell refuses to be separated from the kernel, from the soul. So he says, the inspiration for God consciousness will not arise. You may try 1,000 times with a wet matchstick, but it will not burn. The matchstick has to first dry. The smell of lust and greed has to go. And once that goes, you will find that the liquid of attachment to the worldly pleasures, when it dries up, there is instantaneous inspiration for God. And then you become one with the Purusha, one with your own soul. So this is, we'll conclude here today. The next day, Trailokya is asking the question, after Thakur says that you have to make the matchstick dry, then he asks, how do we dry up our craving for worldly pleasures? As you said, the wetness of the matchstick is responsible for it not to get lighted up when it is struck with the match box. So he says, how do we remove that moisture? How do we remove that worldliness? How do we dry up our craving for worldly pleasures? If that is done, then the fire of knowledge will automatically burn. So that is the answer he will give in the next class. So we shall now conclude here. Tava kathamrutam tapta jivanam kavibiriditam kalmashapaham Shravanamangalam Srimadatam Bhuvi Grananti Ye Bhurida Janaha. Now we have some 10 minutes, we can have some question answers. So I'll just unmute, not you please raise your hands if there are some questions. Yes. Parijat, I've unmuted you.
Swamiji Pranam.
Yes.
I've got a question.
Yes.
You said like we have to be aware of the lust and greed.
Yes.
And the worldly things. And
we have to lessen it. I mean, that is the moisture in this case. The matchstick or the coconut kernel, as long as it is wet, it sticks to the shell of the coconut or it does not light the fire. He gave two examples. So the more the wetness goes away from the matchstick or from the kernel, then there are more chances of realizing one's soul and separating getting the knowledge of the soul, because the knowledge, the attachment to the body does not allow that knowledge to come in our heart, in our person, in our life.
Yeah, but Swamiji, my question is,
yes.
The lust and greed, if we have a relationship, say with our parents or with our friends or whoever, is that also counted as lust and greed?
No, why should it be? Because it is the attitude which is more important. I mean, are we attached to if we do it as duty, see, Sri Ramakrishna had everybody. He had his wife, Sri Ma Sharda Devi was there. Ma Sharda Devi also looked after everybody. She had her nieces, she had her two brothers. They were staying in a very big house. They were apparently connected. She was connected with her whole family. And they were all very selfish. They were after money. They were greedy. But she refused. She did not leave them. But at the same time, she exhibited none of the greed or the lust which was seen in the other people. So you can live. There's no. That's why Sri Ramakrishna is saying it's possible. Like the coconut shell, you don't have to destroy the coconut shell when the kernel is wet. If the kernel is has dried up, the kernel will be inside the coconut shell. The coconut shell can still remain, but then you don't attach yourself. You can do everything. You can have parents. You have to serve your parents. You have to serve everybody who is responsible for you. But then the attitude is all that matters. That's the idea. Sri Ramakrishna says if there is too much of lust and greed and attachment to them in a very gross way, then you don't have that knowledge. Then you get stuck with that. So having connections with them is not bad, but how deep the connections are, how much of water is there, how much of humidity is there, that is more important. That will be answered in the next. In fact, Trailokyanath is asking, because he is now interested to know. Since he is in the world, he wants to ask, how do we get rid of that lust and greed? That is the question which will be answered in the next class. Okay? So we will discuss it next time. We will leave it for that. But definitely having connections doesn't matter. It is just like you can't expect the kernel to be separate from the shell. The shell has to be there, otherwise the coconut, how can it survive? So nobody says that you have to dry it and then destroy the shell, but that connection should not be there. So it is like living in the boat is in the water, but the water is not in the boat. So as long as the water is below the boat, it is fine. But the problem comes when the water enters the wrong side of the boat, and then the boat drowns. That should not happen.
Does that mean that, Swamiji, if we just perform it as a duty rather than getting
Yes.
emotionally connected as well?
Yes, yes. It should be done as a duty, as a spiritual duty. If that then it becomes karma yoga, and then you will be slowly detached from them. You will do it. You will continue to do it maybe till the last moment of your life. So there are people who have done that. You see Arjuna, for example, he had to fight the battle. He had to do everything he was expected to do as a general of his army. So he even killed people. He had to kill people whenever it was necessary to protect dharma. But then his attitude was more important. Sri Krishna taught him how not to get attached. Remember the Lord and then fight. So our attachment should be to the Ishta or the Lord alone. Then that is why Sri Ramakrishna says it's not possible to detach from something unless you attach to somebody else. So to remove the detachment or for lust and greed, we have to attach ourselves to the Lord.
Yeah.
So if one attachment grows, the other attachment decreases. That is the secret.
Okay, Swamiji. Yeah. Thank you.
Anybody? Any more questions? Or should we conclude?
Swami?
Yes.
Nath Gupta.
Who is that? Tridip Nath Gupta. Okay. I'm unmuting you. Just a minute. Yes. Tridip, you can ask.
Yes.
Can
Yes.
you hear me?
Yes. I can hear you. I'll put on the I'll put on the video also. Maharaji, I had just one question. So Thakur says about Kamini Kanchan Tag and also about Sthula Sharira. So that comes in parts, correct? Like Sthula Sharira, as you said, about the coconut and the matchstick. That is the ultimate. So we have to go in stages. So I think what I understood. Yes. So Kamini Kanchan is the first stage, which itself is a very difficult thing for human beings to first forsake and then kind of go into. Is that what it means? Stage by stage?
Exactly. So he's saying progressively one has to become lesser and lesser gross. For example, he's telling many of the householders used to give a very frank advice. He says once one or two children are born, the husband and wife should live like brothers and sisters. So that is partially giving up in stages. You have performed a duty which you have fulfilled, and then after that it's not necessary to be attached to this lust and gold permanently. After you have satisfied a little bit, then he says the husband and wife, why can't they live as brothers and sisters? So try to live as much a pure life as possible. So it is in stages. Obviously, it is in stages. You can't expect a householder to be totally free from all these things. So he says you go from grosser to the higher and higher things. But the real secret here is the more you are attached to the higher, the less you are attached to the lower. So some people just try to avoid the lower, but they don't have any attachment to the higher. In that case, it is difficult to practice that. So you can't just say I should be detached with the lower things without attaching yourself to the higher. It is like if you are so much engrossed in the higher things, you don't have time for the lower things. See, for example, even great scientists, for example, leave alone saints. They are so obsessed with their knowledge, some of them don't even marry. Like for Abdul Kalam's life, you can see. He practically, you may see in his life that this detachment to Kamini and Kanchan came so naturally for him, because his love for knowledge, his love for his profession was so much that it did not permit him to be absorbed in the world at all. So naturally that detachment came very easily for him. So there are examples that if one is attached to the higher, say intellectual pursuit also, if one is concerned with the Vijnanamay quotient, the higher he goes, he doesn't have time for gross pleasures. I have seen many people who think it is just a waste to be wasting our life, valuable life, in the gross pleasures, because they think our energy is limited, our time is limited to be spent in such lower things. If you have a higher goal, see, it may not always be spirituality, it may not always be the realization of Brahman or Atman or God. Many people don't have that as a goal, but they have higher goals. They have goals that they have to achieve something, they have to discover something, they have to live on a higher plane, they are artists. So they have very little time, and their priorities of life are fixed in such a way that they feel that indulging in these lower pleasures is just draining away not only their energy but wasting their valuable time also. So it is not uncommon to see such people, dedicated people, who are not at all gross. I mean, they may not be highly devoted to God or highly spiritual people in that sense, but they are definitely people who live on a higher plane of consciousness than the people who live on a lower plane of consciousness. So I think, is that answer satisfactory?
Yes. So, Maharaji, that means Nishkam Karma is basically the start of the.
Oh yes, Nishkam Karma enables you to change your focus, change your priorities in life. The thing which you did with attachment, you do the same thing without attachment. It gets a totally different color. And the same work, it may be a war also, as it was in the case of Arjuna. In Arjuna's case, it was a horrible war which became Karma Yoga for him, because he was not attached. Sri Krishna taught him that you have to do it as Karma Yoga, then its effect will not, you are not doing it for greed, you are not doing it for gaining something. You are just doing it for the sake of protecting or preserving dharma against the forces of adharma. So if you are doing it with that perspective, not out of greed to get property or to kill somebody, or to, if you do with that attitude, then that very karma, that very same action becomes unselfish and becomes takes you towards liberation. So that exactly is what Sri Krishna is trying to teach us in the Bhagavad Gita, that through Nishkama Karma, you slowly ascend to higher and higher levels, you get that degree of detachment, and then you fight for the Lord. And finally in the 18th chapter he says, Sarva Dharman Parityajya. First he says, fight for Dharma. Then he says, renounce that Dharma, Sarva Dharman Parityajya, Mamekam Sharanam Vraja. Then he says, you even give up that Dharma. Don't be attached to that just because you have won the war. Don't be happy and don't be attached to the kingdom which you get. You rule wisely and be detached. That detachment is emphasized by Krishna throughout. And then he says, after you perform Karma Yoga, naturally your mind will go towards higher and higher levels, and finally you will be detached, and then finally you will surrender to the Lord, which is the goal of your life. So it is a phased progress which we have to do.
Thank
so
you.
there is one more question from Tanvi Sarkar. Yeah. Yes.
Hi, Pranam Maharaji. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Please ask.
Okay. So in a householder's life,
Yes.
I think there is often a confusion between God fear and God love.
God fear.
Yeah. So a lot of people, to my mind,
fear God more than love God.
Yes. And their attachment towards God. How do we graduate from God fearing to God loving?
Oh, that's a good question. Actually, if you look upon God as a king or as a judge, then you fear him. You fear a person who is sitting there above the clouds and trying to give you judgment with a whip in hand, something like Yama, that I will be there to punish you or to give you reward. That is the idea, primitive idea of religion, which most of the religions, the primitive religions teach you that God is somebody whom you should fear. But Sri Ramakrishna very clearly said there cannot be love if there is fear. If you really love your mother, you don't fear her. If you fear your mother, how can you love somebody whom you are afraid of? Huh? So that these two things are absolutely contradictory. That is why this bhava, or this love towards God in any relationship, it can be brother and brother, like Krishna was a brother, or like a brother to Arjuna, or as a friend. So you love your friend. You can't love your friend if you fear him. So Arjuna never feared Sri Krishna. So also Yashoda was a mother to Sri Krishna. She never feared that he is a very powerful person or a spiritual person. She just loved him as she would love her own child, a physical child. So when Sri Ramakrishna told us the same thing in the gospel, and he told the some of the Sikhs who came and said, we respect God, we praise him because he gives us so many wonderful things. Then Sri Ramakrishna will scold them. He said, don't have that attitude. If your parents give you something, you don't thank them. You love them and they give you out of love. There is no question of rewarding you or punishing you. So that idea of reward and punishment, if it goes, God fear can become God's love. Huh? So this is something which depends on your attitude, how you look upon God. If you look upon God as one who is giving judgment and is like a district magistrate, or maybe somebody sitting and waiting for you to commit mistakes and give you punishment, like the police, So if that attitude is there, you'll always fear God. So that's why when people say God fearing, Sri Ramakrishna or even Swamiji did not like that. When he came to the West, he heard this word very often, that we are God-fearing people. He said, why should you fear God? That's the worst thing to happen. We fear people whom we think they are powerful, and we think that we are just servants, or maybe somebody who is waiting for their judgment. So that fear comes if we are further away from God. If we are near to God, or we really love him, then that fear has to go. So the proportion of love you feel for God as your own, as your very own, the proportion of fear decreases in that very same ratio. Okay?
Thank you, Maharaj. Thank you, Maharaj.
Okay. So shall we conclude, or is there any more question? I just saw 2 hands being raised. So if there are no questions, can we take leave for today? Shantanu, you want to ask something? Sharon, any question? Yeah. So I take your leave. So we'll meet next Friday.